There was a fighter who redefined the ground game so completely, opponents called him untouchable, until the UFC intervened. Another's sheer power made certain strikes illegal. As we journey through the fighters who changed the rules, you'll see how their dominance reshaped mixed martial arts itself. Number 1. Royce Gracie. Imagine stepping into a cage against a fighter who seemed untouchable, someone who could take you to the mat and end the fight with surgical precision. Royce Gracie wasn't just winning, he was introducing the world to a revolutionary style of combat: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In the earliest UFC tournaments, the Octagon was a chaotic battleground with few rules and no time limits. Gracie thrived in this unstructured environment. At a lean 176 pounds, he dismantled opponents twice his size, proving that technique outweighed brute strength. The UFC 4 tournament showcased this dominance in a way that forever changed the course of the sport. In the final match against Dan Severn, a wrestler nearly 100 pounds heavier, Gracie employed his methodical grappling skills to survive an excruciating 15-minute struggle. Both fighters spent most of the bout locked in a grueling exchange on the mat, leaving fans restless. Gracie's dominance with BJJ did more than secure victories. It exposed an imbalance. The structureless nature of the early UFC catered to his style, but it also revealed a need for reforms that would maintain the sport's appeal to a wider audience. By introducing time limits, the UFC created a balanced dynamic that encouraged more action while leveling the playing field for fighters with other skill sets. This wasn't just about entertainment. It marked the beginning of a shift toward modern MMA. Gracie's achievements went beyond his era, forcing fighters to evolve their strategies to survive in shorter, higher-paced bouts. His ability to control the ground game redefined competition, but what happens when control is overshadowed by raw, unfiltered chaos? Number 2. Tank Abbott. When Tank Abbott entered the UFC, it wasn't with the polished technique of a martial artist. It was with the raw brute force of a street fighter. Boasting a wrestling background but embracing chaos, Abbott became known for his brutal, unpredictable style that blurred the lines between sport and street brawling. The UFC had been marketed as a no-holds-barred fight spectacle, and Abbott embodied that image, both thrilling and shocking audiences with his approach to combat. At the time, many of Abbott's moves were technically within the loose rules of competition, but his crude tactics drew headlines, and not necessarily the good kind. The sight of a fighter yanking another's hair or exploiting vulnerable points to gain an edge didn't sit well with critics, who began to frame the UFC as unregulated barbarity. Thanks to fighters like Abbott, political figures such as Senator John McCain described the promotion as human cockfighting, adding to the mounting pressure for reform. His bouts became a highly publicized example of the UFC's lack of regulation, putting the organization under scrutiny and forcing it to make sweeping changes to its rulebook. In response to Abbott's style and the backlash it fueled, fouls like hair-pulling and groin strikes were explicitly banned, pushing the UFC toward legitimacy as a professional sport. Number 3. Mark Kerr. What if your head became your most dangerous weapon in the octagon? For Mark Kerr, a powerhouse in the early days of MMA, that idea wasn't hypothetical. It was key to his dominance. Known as the Smashing Machine, Kerr paired world-class wrestling credentials with a bruising ground-and-pound style that featured devastating, and legal at the time, headbutts. Once he got an opponent to the mat, his forehead became a battering ram, driving through guard defenses and forcing referees to step in before the damage became too severe. His technique was effective, but it wasn't without consequence. Fans and commentators began to question whether repeated headbutts were just too dangerous, not only for the fighter on the receiving end, but for Kerr himself, potentially jeopardizing his long-term health. These concerns weren't academic. The damage inflicted could lead to deep cuts, concussions, and lasting trauma, making it increasingly difficult to reconcile such tactics with the growing desire to develop MMA as a serious sport. Mark Kerr's legacy is tied to one of the earliest steps toward a safer, more structured form of MMA. While his tactics forced regulators to act, the next evolution in rulemaking would come from the precision, not the power, of a controversial move. Number 4. Keith Hackney. Keith Hackney walked into the octagon at UFC 3 as a middleweight fighter standing across from Emmanuel Yarbrough, a super heavyweight sumo wrestler towering at over 600 pounds. It was the type of matchup that defined the chaos of early MMA. No weight classes, bare-knuckle strikes, and rules that encouraged creativity, sometimes at the cost of sportsmanship. What followed would become one of the most controversial moments in UFC history, one that prompted the organization to start redefining its boundaries. Hackney, dwarfed by Yarbrough in both size and weight, faced an uphill battle from the first bell. This was no ordinary fight, and Hackney's approach reflected that. Aware of the overwhelming physical advantages his opponent brought to the cage, Hackney targeted the area of least resistance, Yarbrough's groin. Repeatedly, Hackney drove strikes into his much larger opponent's most vulnerable spot, forcing Yarbrough to crumble under the pain. Hackney's unconventional tactics forced the UFC to confront the balance between raw entertainment and professionalism. Exploiting vulnerabilities was one way to win. But what happens when skill rewrites the rulebook instead? Number 5. Penn. Penn didn't just compete in mixed martial arts, he broke the boundaries that defined it. Known as the Prodigy, Penn was one of the rare fighters who seemed unconstrained by the weight divisions meant to keep competition fair. In an era when fighters typically stayed within a single weight class, Penn's willingness to climb the scale and challenge larger opponents revealed a critical flaw in the UFC's framework. Weight classes were too broad and in some cases poorly regulated. Penn built his reputation in the lightweight division, where his technical skill and adaptability put him leagues above most of his peers. However, what truly set him apart was his ambition to step outside of his natural weight class and face physically larger and stronger opponents. This ambition was on full display at UFC 46, when he moved up to welterweight to face then-champion Matt Hughes. Hughes, a dominant wrestler and the defending title holder, was expected to overpower Penn with his size and strength advantage. Instead, it was Penn who dominated the fight, submitting Hughes in the first round with a rear-naked choke. The victory not only secured Penn's status as one of the most versatile fighters of his era, but also forced the UFC to reckon with how it structured its divisions. Penn's dominance forced fairness into the equation, but when it came to cage tactics, another fighter challenged an altogether different kind of rule. Number 6. Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva's legacy as one of the greatest strikers in MMA history isn't just about his precision or creativity, it's also tied to his ability to exploit the environment of the octagon itself. Known for his unmatched timing and mastery of distance, Silva often utilized the cage to give himself a controversial edge. During takedown attempts by opponents, he would strategically grab the fence to steady his balance or disrupt their momentum. At a glance, it might seem like a minor act, but in the split-second chaos of an MMA fight, a single grab could shift the balance between being taken to the ground or keeping the fight on the feet, where Silva usually held the advantage. This tactic became especially contentious during Silva's fights with Chael Sonnen, most notably in their first bout at UFC 117. Sonnen, a wrestler known for his relentless ground and pound, dominated the fight for nearly 5 rounds, repeatedly taking Silva to the mat. But replays showed moments where Silva subtly grabbed the cage to resist takedowns. Though it didn't prevent Sonnen's control entirely, it raised eyebrows regarding how such split-second actions could influence a fight. Fans and commentators debated whether those moments tipped the scales in Silva's favor and added fuel to the ongoing discussion about enforcing rules more rigorously to ensure fair competition. Silva's cage-grabbing tactics remain a point of debate when discussing his dominance, but they also left an unmistakable mark on UFC regulations. As the rulebook tightened, innovators like Silva kept finding ways to challenge its limits, paving the way for even more significant reforms ahead. Number 7. Jon Jones. How do you stop a fighter who turns the rulebook into his toolbox? Jon Jones didn't just adapt to MMA's rules, he reinvented how they were used. Known for his creative and controversial striking, Jones mastered techniques that caught opponents off guard and left the MMA world debating their fairness. Among his most iconic moves was the oblique kick, a sharp, targeted strike aimed at an opponent's knee. It was the kind of technique that made fighters hesitate to press forward and made fans question if it should even be allowed. Jones's oblique kick first gained serious attention in fights like his bout with Rampage Jackson at UFC 135. Jackson, a heavy-hitting veteran, found himself repeatedly on the wrong end of that precisely timed strike. Each kick bent Jackson's leg backward unnaturally, halting his attacks and forcing him to rethink his approach. It wasn't just Jones's ability to land these strikes that caused concern, it was what they could do. Many argued the move put fighters at risk of severe injuries, like torn ligaments or even career-ending joint damage. For fans, this raised the question, how far could innovation in striking go before safety had to take precedence? Jon Jones didn't just dominate his opponents, he reshaped the space between what was permissible and what was ethical. While rules adapted to his style, another fighter's influence would shift the focus toward grappling dominance, highlighting the need for precision in officiating. Number 8. Travis Browne. Travis Browne had a unique approach to defending takedowns, one that quickly made waves in the heavyweight division. and across the UFC as a whole. While most fighters relied on sprawling or scrambling to counter grappling attempts, Browne introduced a far more violent solution: downward elbows. These strikes were delivered in a straight 12-6 motion, targeting opponents' heads while they attempted to secure a takedown. What made this technique so effective wasn't just the damage it inflicted, but the way it completely neutralized grappling exchanges, turning defense into offense in spectacular fashion. The most infamous display of Browne's downward elbows came at UFC on Fox 11 against Gabriel Gonzaga. Gonzaga, a seasoned veteran known for his submission skills, looked to use his grappling edge to take Browne to the mat. But as Gonzaga moved in for the takedown, Browne unleashed a series of sharp, precise elbows to the back of his opponent's head and neck. Gonzaga collapsed to the canvas, suffering a brutal knockout that left little room for uncertainty about the effectiveness of Browne's approach. While the fight showcased his ability to adapt and innovate inside the octagon, it also ignited heated debates about whether such techniques blurred the line between skillful striking and unnecessary brutality. Browne's downward elbows forced a technical adjustment in how referees interpreted MMA's striking rules, but they also reinforced the constant tension between innovation and regulation in the sport. Number 9. Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib Nurmagomedov's grappling wasn't just dominant, it was suffocating. Known for his relentless pressure and control, Khabib's fights often appeared one-sided, with opponents trapped beneath him as he methodically broke their will. But while his strategy was undeniably effective, it also raised concerns among fans and analysts who criticized his style for creating long stretches of inaction. These accusations of stalling grew loudest in matchups like his bout with Edson Barboza at UFC 219, where Khabib neutralized Barboza's striking with constant takedowns and smothering pressure. Though the bout showcased Khabib's mastery of grappling, the lack of consistent striking or submission attempts frustrated some viewers. Critics argued that while Khabib's control was a technical marvel, his ability to keep opponents pinned without advancing the fight posed a challenge to MMA's entertainment value. Fans wanted action, dynamic exchanges, submissions, or high-level striking, and instead, often saw Khabib chaining techniques to maintain his dominant position. This brought to light the question of how referees should handle prolonged ground control that failed to create significant opportunities for finishes. Grappling purists might have appreciated the subtlety in his movements, but casual fans and even some competitors viewed parts of his approach as skirting the edge of stalling. Khabib's dominance forced this evolution in officiating, shaping how action is enforced in grappling-heavy fights. His unprecedented control reshaped expectations in the octagon. But while his ground game redefined dominance, another fighter would soon change the narrative of MMA entirely. This time, in the realm of women's competition. Number 10. Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey was a fighter whose impact extended far beyond her signature armbar. At a time when the UFC had no women's divisions, Rousey's dominance did the unthinkable. It created one. Her ability to consistently submit opponents and finish fights in record time wasn't just impressive, it was transformative. Before Rousey, women's MMA had largely been sidelined, seen as a niche within a male-dominated sport. That changed with her arrival in 2012, as her performances demanded the UFC take notice. Her signature armbar became her calling card. Time after time, opponents would find themselves trapped, unable to escape before they were forced to tap. In one of her earliest displays of dominance, Rousey faced Liz Carmouche at UFC 157, the first ever women's title fight in the promotion's history. Though Carmouche managed to put Rousey in danger early, it didn't faze the champion for long. Rousey locked in yet another armbar in the first round, securing her victory and cementing her status as a trailblazer. It wasn't just her submission skills that elevated her, it was the speed and efficiency of her wins, with most of them coming in under a minute. With Rousey leading the charge, the UFC expanded its roster of female fighters, created additional weight classes, and adapted its rules to support the growing divisions. Her reign wasn't just a milestone, it was a movement. The history of MMA is written by fighters who changed more than just outcomes. They changed the sport itself. Their styles, strategies, and dominance forced the UFC to rethink its rules, creating the balance between artistry and fairness that defines modern competition. From Royce Gracie's submission mastery to Jon Jones's innovative striking, each fighter challenged the boundaries of the rulebook, leaving behind an undeniable impact. These pioneers pushed MMA forward, shaping both how fights are contested and how they're judged. The question now is, which fighters today are rewriting tomorrow's rules? Leave your thoughts below. The evolution of MMA is far from over.